ago, about 2,000 years ago, there was a Greek, and he said everything on this planet is made up of tiny little items. 2,000 years later, he called them atoms, and 2,000 years later, he's right. Anyway, in the last century, in the beginning of the last century, scientists started to analyse and look at these small particles, and in 1919, Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander scientist working at Cambridge University, he split one of these atoms in two. And another time he was firing particles through a very thin sheet of gold, and some of the particles bounced back. And he said it's like firing a 15-inch naval gun at a piece of toilet paper, and have the thing bounce back. So gradually they started to learn the construction not only of atoms, which have a central large heavy bit, and some distance away a negatively charged particle, about 1/2000th of the mass, called an electron. And the gap in between, compared to the size of the particles, is immense. And that's why when Rutherford fired at his atoms, some of them went through, but the ones that hit the big particles in the nucleus bounced back. So gradually they found that the construction of different items on the chemical table, starting with hydrogen, going right through to the very end, and the table was put together by a Russian called Mendeleev, and one of the articles in it is called Mendeleev, and the other end of the scale was uranium, big heavy atom. But what they didn't realise when they first got the table was that out in the universe there was another one, a little bit heavier, but it was so unstable that it decayed away very quickly. And that came to be known as plutonium. And then when the Second World War came along, obviously, out in Germany, there were some Jewish scientists, both in Germany and in Austria, and they were looking at atoms breaking apart in rocks. And it was uranium-235, the lighter uranium, that with thermal neutrons, if one of them hits it, can split it in two bits. And what comes out as well as when it's split is lots of energy. Some of the mass has turned into energy, like Einstein's equation. Energy is mass times the speed of light squared. Now, the speed of light squared is a very big number, but it doesn't change, which means a very small amount of mass changed into energy makes a huge amount of energy. And so they looked at this breaking apart of uranium in rocks, and there are lots of rocks in Cornwall, and the background radiation in Cornwall is 7 times what it is in Reading, due to the fission of uranium in the rocks. And if you build a house in a place where there are rocks, like my wife, who built a house in an island in the Atlantic off the coast of Ireland, you have to have a sheet in the foundations that blocks radon, a radioactive gas, coming up into the house, because it'll give you cancer. And so, as you go on, you learn things. It's just like the pandemic. Lots of things go wrong because it's new. Just the same as Gavin said, that they were learning what radiation will do to people. And they sent people out to walk in amongst all the rubbish and killed an enormous amount. Some of the pilots that flew through the mushroom clouds all died. And the government denied it for 20 years and then told the families and admitted it. Right, now, one of the particles that's in the nucleus was discovered by a guy called James Chadwick, and he put some particles from hydrogen through a magnetic field. And one of them was deflected very quickly, and that was hydrogen, which is just one positively charged proton with one negatively charged electron. But then there was one that was further out and further out again. And they were about double the weight and 3 times the weight. And he said there must be a particle in there that's the same size as a neutron and no charge. And because it had no charge, he called it the neutron. And in 1931-32, he was proved to be right. And the proton and the neutron are roughly the same mass. And all the atoms we've got in our chemical table have protons and neutrons in their nucleus, with electrons buzzing around the outside in very distinct energy levels. And there's a bloke called Niels Bohr, a scientist who played football in the Netherlands, and so did his son. But he showed that the laws of physics inside the atom are different to the laws of physics that are outside the atom. And we still know they must be connected, but they haven't yet found how. Anyway, that's some of the physics. My wife always says that when you talk about physics, everyone goes to sleep. So, right. So now, this is the Nevada test site where the Americans tested a lot of their weapons above ground. And if you look, there are people sitting in deck chairs watching it. Now, how dumb is that? But, oh yes, here we have Oppenheimer. If anyone saw the film, I'm sure loads of you did, I never realised he was such a womanizer. But when he tested Trinity, the first nuclear test in the desert near Los Alamos, I was about a month old, so I doubt whether I'd have been any use to him. There's Oppenheimer, a great scientist even before he became the leader of the production of the atom bomb in America. Now, there were these Jewish scientists in Germany and in Austria. One of them was a lady, Lisa Meitner, and to her nephew, Otto Frisch, who wrote my particle physics book when I was at college, and a guy who became the mathematics professor at Birmingham University. They looked at this fissioning of uranium, and they said that if you could get enough uranium-235, about 2 kilograms, if you broke one of them, when it broke apart, not only does it produce energy, it it fires up to three very, very powerful, fast neutrons. And if they hit other atoms, they would split them as well. So you get 9. And if they fired 3, you get 27. That system could very rapidly go ahead and produce an astronomical amount of energy. And that, they said, using that, a bomb is possible. And Rudolf Perls, the professor at Birmingham University, wrote to Churchill and said, this could be a bomb and it could change the war. And the Germans were already working on it, but Hitler didn't like it. He called it Jewish science. And so loads of the Jewish scientists came to this country, Otto Frisch, Rudolf Perls, and others, and Lisa Meitner went up to Scandinavia to escape the Nazis. However, Churchill realised it was possible, so he went across to the President of America and persuaded him, and Einstein, with another scientist, wrote to the President as well, and that's what made them start the process of making an atom bomb. This picture shows uranium-235 fissioning, breaking into 2 parts, and the particles going and splitting other atoms to make this system whereby huge amounts of energy can be released. As they go on, they hit other atoms, and then they hit more atoms, and this exponential rise of production of energy is the atom bomb. There, you can see that it splits apart, and you get these 3 fast particles going off to split others. Now, there are 2 types of uranium, uranium-235 and uranium-238. And the 238 needs very fast particles coming in from outer space, from suns blowing up and all the rest of it, to actually fission that. And you can use that, but 235 fissions with thermal neutrons. However, they found, the scientists in Britain, that if you made a nuclear pile, you could make plutonium, which is the one that's heavier. And it's got an isotope, 1 particle in its nucleus less, that will fission it more easy than uranium-235. And the British contingent that went over to Oppenheimer said, you need to make plutonium and you need to make a spherical bomb. Because where they got uranium-235, they only had enough to make 1 bomb. And they used a tube device. They put the 2 bits of uranium-235, put conventional explosives either side of it, blew it together to a critical mass, fired a few particles into it to get it going. But if you used that method, that was the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, but if you used plutonium in a tube device, it had a very good chance of going off on its own. So they designed this spherical bomb where you put conventional explosive pads all around it with a special design. And when it fired, you had detonators in each of the pads. And when it fired, it crushed the plutonium down. And they fired some neutrons into it, and you got the same process of producing energy. Now, when they fired the test shot in the desert, it was that type of bomb. And the Americans were so grateful to the British for bringing the idea in and helping them to make it, that they gave a model of tritium, of the plutonium bomb, to Aldermaston. And if you go into Aldermaston, in through the gate, right opposite is the admin building. And outside are two memory things. One is the model that the Americans gave us, and the other is the parachute regiment who flew out of there when it was an airfield in the Second World War for Operation Market Garden. And so the two, if you go into Aldermaston, look out for them. Now, one of the people that you would have seen in the film, who Oppenheimer wasn't very happy with, he was the one that said we shouldn't be working on an atom bomb, we should be working on a bomb that makes its energy the same way as the sun. Much more powerful. This is why they called it the hydrogen bomb, because the hydrogen, as I said, is one proton with an electron going around. But it's got two isotopes. One has one neutron, so it's twice as heavy, and one has two neutrons in, so it's 3 times as heavy. And the sun crushes those together in temperatures of between 1 and 15 million degrees centigrade. And with enormous pressure, because it's a big planet, it crushes them and it jumps into a helium nucleus, which is 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Some of the binding energy is lost, and some of the mass is lost, and that has all turned into energy. So that type of bomb is much more powerful, much more powerful. But they use other things now rather than hydrogen. They use things like lithium deuteride. And the Americans, in one of their tests in the Pacific, the first time they used lithium deuteride, it had lots of lithium-6, which would work as a fuel, and a lot of lithium-7, which they said would work. And they estimated that it would be the equivalent of 5 million tons of explosive, right? Conventional explosive. However, what they didn't realise was that the particles flying around hit lithium-7, knocked a particle out of it, and it became lithium-6. And there was therefore a lot more fuel in there than they thought. And when the shot went off, it was the equivalent of 15 million tons of explosive. Now, they knew which way the mushroom cloud would be blown by the wind, but it went so high, the wind was blowing in the opposite direction. And it blew it out over the Pacific, over one of their battleships, which was protected against nuclear pollution. But further out, 50 miles out, was a Japanese fishing boat. And it was called the Lucky Dragon. They should have called it the Unlucky Dragon, because all the guys in there lost their hair, radiation burns, they were being sick. They got back to Japan, but how many of them survived, I don't know. However, it just shows how things can go wrong. When we tested bombs in Australia, a friend of mine who came on to the shots in America, he was in Maralinga, and he said that he went out after the explosion into the desert to pick up radioactive particles, and he was in a suit and all the rest of it for protection. And he got to the ground zero, and there was a family of Aborigines had seen the bomb go off just like in the films you've just seen, and they thought it was God. And they went there, and they quickly had to take them back to the base, and they put them through the showers 6 times, and they were still radioactive, and they took them away and let them wander off into the desert. Who knows if they died? So we were no angels either. In one case, we took guys from the RAF, luckily not Jeffrey, and we took them to Porton Down and told them they were going to do research for the common cold. And we put nerve gas over them and killed them, and didn't admit it to the families for 20 years. The other thing, when I went to America, I saw a film of a nuclear test in a mountain. They drilled into the mountain and did the test after backfilling the hole. And they blew the side of the mountain out. And all the pollution came out. And one of the guys I spoke to was a French miner, and he wanted to come back and work on the Channel Tunnel, and they wouldn't let him, and they said they wouldn't give him his job back. He ran the wrong way, and all in his car, and he got covered in radioactive ash. He was sick, lost his hair, radiation burns, and all the rest of it. And I met him at Mercury when I was out there for all the tests that I was involved with were British. And in the 70s, 80s and early 90s, there were about 20 British nuclear tests. And we set up in 92 for another one. If you look at my hat, it says ice cap. And it was a great pity it didn't go ahead, because it was a joint American and British test, and what they would have learned would have reduced pollution, made nuclear warheads safer. If someone had nicked one, that they wouldn't ever be able to turn it into a nuclear bomb. But it was the test ban treaty came in, and in the end we signed the test ban treaty in Europe, and that was the end. So that particular test was abandoned. The reason why the Americans were so grateful for us to do the round plutonium bomb was because of all the people like James Tuck, Rudolf Perls, and a guy called Klaus Fuchs. He was a principal scientific officer at Harwell, the atomic energy place. This is next to the Lyford High Energy Lab. And he had such a good opinion of himself, he wanted to share his research with the world, but he just gave it to Russia. And he was very hard to catch. But we found out in 1950 that he was giving everything away by the fact that a Russian defected to Britain and said, "You want to watch that bloke, Klaus Fuchs, because he's giving all your secrets away." So we eventually caught him, and he was swapped for someone that the Russians had got of ours. That is an atom bomb, and it's the same really as the one that was dropped on Nagasaki. And you can see inside there's plutonium pit, and these are the plates of high explosive, and the guys sticking in the detonators to set it, and they crush it down and they fire neutrons into it to set off the production of the energy. But look at the size of it. It's monstrously big, and it's only an atom bomb. Now, if you're going to get a bomb to work that's making energy the same way as the sun, a thermonuclear bomb, how do you get the temperature and pressure on the sun? They explode an atom bomb first, and that will give you the temperatures. So you find with a thermonuclear bomb, it has a primary and a secondary. The primary is an atom bomb, and that gets the other bit to work to crush the bits together to make energy in a similar way to the sun. This is the scientist Leo Szilard. He got Einstein to write to the President of America to tell him that a bomb was possible, and the Germans were working on it, and after the Japs had hit the harbour, he decided to go ahead and make the atom bomb. Now, Otto Frisch was the lady I told you about, Lise Meitner. He was working with her, and he was her nephew. And there's Lise Meitner. They're a very lovely lady, and she did a runner to the north of Norway or Sweden to try and escape the Nazis. Okay. Well, I think we saw that. These guys, as you can see, there's Oppenheimer. This guy in the front became the leader of Los Alamos. Enrico Fermi was a Nobel Prize winner for an Italian-American. The bloke behind him, he used to put all these equations on the side of his little van that he used to go off camping in. And there's another bloke over there, Kellogg, and this is just after 1945, after the atomic bomb had been dropped on the Japs, etc. There's Enrico Fermi. For any electronic engineers, they will have heard of Fermi levels. Electrons in copper, some of them are bound in, some of them are free, and he got the Nobel Prize for physics. And he built the first nuclear reactor under the tennis court of Chicago University. And I've got a lovely picture of him in a filthy old vest, sawing up carbon moderator blocks to build his nuclear reactor. And they made plutonium in that reactor. Little Boy was the pipe device that was dropped on Hiroshima, where they crushed two bits together and then fired some stuff into it. But if he was made of plutonium, it could go off by itself. But that's the one they dropped on Hiroshima. That big fat one, obviously, had that bomb that you saw inside it, and that was dropped on Nagasaki. And that was the one that was done to the British design. There it is again. Now these guys, these were at a British test, a very early British test, and I'll tell you who some of them were. That guy, second guy in, became head of physics at Aldermaston. This guy was the scientist who was the chief scientist on Britain's first test, which was in a little old frigate at the Montebello Islands. And obviously when the shot went off, the frigate was vaporised. But by then he'd got onto the HMS Campaign, 20 miles away. And he was a Welshman, And he used to sit at Aldermaston and jump up on the bench and listen to everything that was going. And he was given the title of Count of Montebello. And he was making a speech in London, and he said, I know they called me that because I heard a sailor say, here comes the little Count Anne. That guy became head of metallurgy in Aldermaston, and the guy at the top, I think, is Bill Penny, he was on an aeroplane that watched with an RAF famous guy that got the Victoria Cross, and they watched the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. And he was on the plane as well. Okay. Again, very similar. Oh, there's the Lucky Dragon. See the Lucky Dragon? Got smothered with radioactive. And the other dreadful thing that happened in that test was they had 20 miles away a concrete bunker making measurements of the shot. And it became lethally radioactive, and they rushed a helicopter in and pulled them out and forgot about all the people on a neighbouring island. A lot of them died. They got them out the next day, but this year they went back to the island to see if the people could go back to their island. Still too radioactive. Some of the half-lives of the particles is hundreds of years. Now this particular bomb was the largest nuclear weapon or bomb ever designed or tested, and it's Russian. And it was designed by a guy called Andrei Zakharov. And, oh, here he is. He designed it at 100 megatons and tested it at 50. But he was so polluting all over the world that he persuaded people to test underground. And the man who built the biggest weapon in history was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Some people know. Now, one of the reasons for nuclear testing was to miniaturize nuclear weapons. This is a little Harrier jump jet, right? Britain doesn't use them anymore, but Spain are still flying them. It is a fighter. It's the fighter plane we used against the Argentinians. And underneath it there is WE-177, a thermonuclear bomb, very, very much more powerful than those dropped on Japan. And look at the size of it. But in the end, we decided not to use it. However, recently, we've bought a lot of very, very fast jets from America, which were designed to carry nuclear weapons. So whether or not we'll design a new WE-177 or not, I don't know. But you can see how small it is. Miniaturization. But however, the Chinese, it took America 20 years to miniaturize their nuclear weapons. And the Chinese did it overnight. You can guess how they did it overnight. One of the guys working at Los Alamos, his wife was a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party, and she was a regular visitor to the Chinese embassy in Russia. They reckon he emailed out the computer codes. This is the Nevada test site. Now, the NTS, the Nevada test site, is only a bit of a huge area, which is the American bombing and strafing range. But as you can see, it's about 70 miles northwest of Las Vegas. And the one thing of being out there for 14 years was that you lived in Las Vegas. This, beyond where the two top arrows are, is the main testing area on the Nevada test site, which is Yucca Flat. And that the sandy bit, sometimes if it rains, it's got water all over it, only about an inch deep. But a lot of tests are done up in the mountains. And I'll tell you a story. We were in the steakhouse in Mercury, which is on defence land, and the waitresses there were filling us up with green Hungarian wine. And I forget how many bottles empty on the table. But my colleague Spike said, do you know, my mother's seen a programme on BBC Two that says you can see scorpions under cactuses with an ultraviolet light. And I said, I've got one in my room. He said, let's go out and look for cactuses. So we went out, walked out into the desert, and we were looking for the scorpions, and all of a sudden, desert vehicles with heavy machine guns came screaming across to us, police, jeeps, and God knows what else, and they leapt out of their vehicles, pointing rifles at us. And I said, what on earth's going on? And he said, you British, 10 more rifles. And if I hadn't been so drunk, I might have been frightened, but I was laughing my head off. And I said, I've got a badge. And he said, this one's got a badge. And Spike had wandered over to a police jeep, and he said, what's going on? And the bloke grabbed a shotgun from above the windscreen and pointed at me. He said, I've got a badge too. And so they said, what are you doing? And they said, well, his mum. And they disappeared as fast as they came. 2 days later, we found out why. We were firing the shot, and I was in the control room, and I suppose you realise what it's like. You're sitting there, and you've got screens all around you, like the blokes when the blokes go into outer space. And one of my screens was focused down on the ground zero, which was up in the mountains. And I looked at it, and I couldn't believe it. There were people walking about round the ground zero. Now, when the Americans did a test off the west coast of America, and Chitka, it was a big shot, but the ground motion vertically was 20 to 40 feet in a few thousandths of a second. To use an American expression, if you were there, you'd be squished. We would say squashed. Well, I didn't want these people to be squashed, so I thought they'd send the helicopter gunships up there, see what was going on. They didn't, they got in their cars. And hours later, they got up there and arrested 3 British girls and an American. And they'd walked across the Nevada desert and up into the mountains to protest against the shot. Now, we may not have agreed with their sentiments, but we told the Americans we were quite proud of them. We were up at 4 o'clock in the morning, a 5-hour delay, the bastards, the Americans were saying. But our attitude was that it's better if the knife was never invented. It's better if the sword was never invented. Better if the rifle was never invented. But if explosives were never developed, or thermonuclear devices. But once they have, You can't be an ostrich and stick your head in the sand and pretend they don't exist. Or someone like Adolf Hitler will come and kick you off the backside. So when it's been developed, you've got to do the best thing you can. And we've got them in submarines, and we tell everyone, you hit us, you'll regret it. And this is the longest period in our history where our sovereignty hasn't been threatened. So that's doing the best you can under the circumstances. This is Yucca Flat, the sandy bit, and you see all those holes. They're about a quarter of a mile across, and they're hemispherical. They're all nuclear weapons tests, and what happens is, when the device goes off 2,000 feet under the ground, it melts a huge cavern. Gradually, some of that will go down into liquid at the bottom, but because it's sandy, in the end it collapses. And they've got geophones on it to make sure you're somewhere safe when it starts to collapse. There are the crater statistics. They were going, you see the cars, very small on the side there, and what they were doing, they put a small bomb 600 feet under the ground, and the idea was to put a whole line of them and dig a new Panama Canal. However, it was so radioactive, they gave up the idea. But now, you go there by coach and visit the hole. This is 904, and you can see the protection against the ground motion, because it's only about half a mile from the ground zero. It's on shock mounts and tied to the ground. And that has to be so that the equipment inside is not damaged, and it can measure the temperatures and fluxes at the time of detonation. This is the inside of a trailer using oscilloscopes to measure the results from the shot. Being prepared for the shots, because you can see they don't have ordinary cameras on, they're about to have film put in here to record the results. All the lights are switched off, and it all happens automatically because you're 20 or 30 miles away. I wouldn't like to tell you who that is, but I was a lot younger then. As you can see, the ground zero is here, and all those trailers would be gone on the day of fires, and all the cables come out to the trailers there where the results are measured, so that when the collapse takes place, the trailers don't go down that hemispherical hole. This was the final dry run of one test, and I'd been off to get some information from the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory photographers. And when I got back, the final dry run had started, and they'd locked the door and they wouldn't let me in. And there are British trailers on Yucca Flat, ready, waiting for a test. That's the test Barnwell. All the instrumentation you had in racks, you had to ground and earth the racks. But in a desert, it's so dry, they had to have a salty pond and drive metal with spikes 12 feet down into the pond, and to get it and then take it to the trailer to make sure you had a good grounding. And the British bought a rubber garden gnome, and they sat with him fishing into the pond, and the Americans put a noose round his neck and hung him up, and we had a notice made up, please don't abuse the gnome, and we put him back fishing in the pond. Now, when the rack engineer of that particular shop retired, I presented him with the gnome, and I met him 2 years later. It had loads of labels on it, rat safe and all that, not radioactive. And when I met him 2 years later, he said, it's just like the Barnwell gnome. He said, where did you get another one from? I said, some mad American went down into the hemispherical dome on a rope and got the gnome that had fallen down, because we put him on the top of the ground zero, and when the shot went off, he obviously went into orbit, and he fell down into the, and this mad American went down and got it. They put it through rad safe, and I said, the gnome you have got is the Barnwell gnome. So, this is the last British shot. As you can see, it's a very famous British engineer who built the bridge and the first steam. Anyone know who he is? This is a bit out of focus, but it is a map of the Nevada test site, and all those badges are British nuclear weapons tests. And it'll show you on the Nevada test site where the test took place. Now this is a group of lads for Bristol, and do you recognise one?
Far left.
Far left, you're correct. There he is there. We did an anagram of Bristol, and we had low Brits and old Brits and Bristol. And that was Britain's last test. We did set up for another one, ice cap, but sadly it was stopped by the moratorium by the American president, and then the year after we signed the test ban treaty, so it never actually took place. This was off a calendar by one of the laboratories, and the weapon is in that tub at the bottom of this diagnostic rack, where it's all time-of-flight tubes and detectors to measure all the things you want to know when the device goes off. That particular shot was the device that eventually became the Trident warhead. And that crane could take 100 tons, but they only ever operated up to about 70 tons. But in between all those experiments, they filled it with lead to stop them interfering with each other. That hole that is about to be pushed down is about 2,000 feet deep. Now, our test director was approaching retirement, and he went down to the ground zero during this process. It was delivered on a lorry, and it was lined up with lasers and married to the bottom of the diagnostic rack. And then it was swung over and inserted into the hole. And he was sitting in a deck chair and he went to sleep. And Los Alamos photographer came and took his photograph. And he was put on the wall of the laboratory with the caption, "Only an Englishman could go to sleep during marriage and insertion." That is Don, and he's presenting the American test director, Joe Beanie, with a photograph. And it's Aldermaston Village. And that was when he retired. He was an ex-RAF officer, and a fantastic after-dinner speaker. He used to have the Americans in stitches. That's the crane for Bristol, and a lot of all the Americans and some of us and everything sitting there. That's some of the lads outside the trailer. Some of the guys, two of my guys, and Peter Sankey, he went to Geneva to advise on the signing of the Test Ban Treaty, and they gave him the OBE, and we told him it was other buggers' efforts. There's a young scientist talking to the Americans, and that's I got everyone to sign, a lot of Americans and a lot of British, to sign it on the trailer. And the waitress from the steakhouse in Mercury, on the back, she said, "What's the name of your wife?" So I told her. And she wrote on it, "Love and kisses, Eddie." Only kidding, Clodagh. These used to appear in the newspapers. Yes, Roseanne. That was a very early one, probably in the early Roseanne Kidney. Yeah, that would be in the early 80s. This is the entrance to the Nevada test site, just off the about 5 miles off the main road. And although you see those few little boats there was something equivalent to our SAS just out of sight. So if anyone tried to get in, they shouldn't. They'd have been blown away. Now, Los Alamos photographer took this. This was a courtesy visit by French Airlines to Las Vegas. And I told them he was coming in, and the Los Alamos photographer went down and took the picture and gave me a copy of it. Yes, here's my wife, kids, her sister, her mother and father. I flew backwards and forwards so much, I had free tickets. So I gave them all free tickets to go to Florida. Then the Americans did something incredibly stupid. They gave us a hole to put the bomb down. So it was drilled 3 years before, and they'd forgotten there was water in the bottom. We were lowering the bomb, and luckily the crane driver realised it had gone light and quickly pulled it up. It took them a fortnight to pull it out. It was all rusty, but the water had stopped 2.5 inches under the device. So we took it to pieces and rebuilt it, and it was fine, and the test was a huge success. But while this was going on, there was such a delay, the test director, the new test director, Harry, he was giving everyone a couple of days off with the weekend. They could go off charging around California and all the rest of it. When it came to me, he gave me 1 day on Wednesday. And I wanted to get on a plane, go to my family and visit them and come back. And years later, when I got to know Harry, I said, "What's that all about, Harry?" He said, I knew where you would go, and I was frightened you wouldn't come back. He thought we were all a bunch of scallywags. Anyway, my opposite number, Jim Armstrong, on the American side, he said, "Don't worry, Eddie." He said, "I'll go into town, get a couple of shotguns and some ammo, and we go up country, duck hunting." So we used my car, my hire car, to go up, and we got it covered in mud and went duck hunting. In the morning when we got there, it was 30 degrees below freezing. By lunchtime, it was so hot that I rolled my neoprene waders down, put my shotgun by the side, and went to sleep. And Jim came up and took my one photograph, this one, and he was putting ducks all around my head to take another one when I woke up. And he put this on the wall of the lab with the caption, "The second best thing Eddie does in rubber." This is a Trident submarine, and you would never believe the size of it. They are monstrous in size compared to the little submarines we had before. One of those had the firepower of the whole of the Polaris fleet. They're monstrous. However, they are coming to the end of their days, and we are already rebuilding new submarines. The other thing is, I told you plutonium was very unstable. Now, they did mix it with something to make it more stable. And they said, "What should we mix it with?" He said, "What we got in the cupboards." So, anyway, it's so unstable that after 20 years, America and Britain at huge expense have got to replace all their plutonium warheads. And it must be costing this country an absolute fortune. But you've got no alternative but to do it. Now, they kept it very quiet until someone got hold of it, and it was published in the Scientific American, which my wife had bought me, and I read all about it. And I said to a friend of mine who's still working at Aldermaston that we were doing it, and he said, "How did you know?" So I knew they were doing it. Because I retired 24 years ago. Anyway, I think we're near the end. There's Oppenheimer and a bloke who eventually didn't like nuclear testing and didn't want anything to do with it.
Is that your end?
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to give a big round of applause for Eddie. That's the end of his lecture.